Chapter 5. Shadows Creeping. The sound washed over them like a tidal wave. Ray struggled to breathe, the vibrations surging through her chest, crushing her heart. The windows at the end of the hall exploded into dust, as did the large mirror on the wall, showering them with shards of glass. Ray held her hands to her ears and grit her teeth and fell to her knees. The hairs inside of her head burned. Her vision jittered. Nausea jumped up her throat. When she thought she could endure no more, that the sound would surely kill her, crush her flat, it stopped. Silence fell. Absolute. Complete. She opened her eyes, not remembering when she'd closed them, and looked around. Mitsue met her gaze, sitting up and rubbing his head. She looked at Ernley. Gone was the customary smile, as was the fury of a moment before, all vigor extinguished in the rush of sound. The color leached from his sapphire eyes. He stared back, his mouth hanging partway open, Ray's blood trundling unnoticed from his chin to pool on the floor. Barnes and Floret cradled their heads and crouched like dogs. No one moved. No one spoke, as if they'd all forgotten how, as if the sound had turned them all to stone. And then, screams, first one, cracking through their ears, then another, shrill, terrible, hurtling down the halls like fluid rushing through a tube, cutting down through their bones. The screams jammed Ray's mind back into gear, pulled her to her feet. She grabbed Mitsue's hand. "Come on," she said, already moving. The sound had shrunk her thoughts, her fears, her anxieties, down to this one thing. They're coming. She pulled Mitsue along behind her. He stumbled on wooden legs. "The bells, it couldn't be real, could it? I mean, there's no way," Mitsue stuttered. "I don't know," Ray said, a pressure building behind her left eye. She felt like she might be sick, but we have to go. "Where are you going?" Ernley asked from where he lay on the floor, his voice little more than a whisper. "Maybe they made a mistake." "They must have," Mitsue muttered, as if saying it made it true. "A mistake, that's all it is." With a whoosh, the gas lamps all along the corridor flared to life, hurling their shadows forward. Ray squinted in the sudden radiance. She was aware of every inch of her senses, Mitsue's clammy hand in hers, her heartbeat sloshing around her extremities, pounding in her ears, her stomach like a shriveled thing sticking its claws into her back, climbing the rungs of her ribs. The light thrust her dread into sudden contrast. She needed to run. She pulled at Mitsue's hand. "Hurry." The hall slipped by beneath them. "Where are you going?" Ernley called again. Mitsue slammed to a stop, halting Ray in her tracks. "Where are we going?" he asked. In truth, she had no idea. The bells had wrung all sense from her brain, instinct rushing in to fill the void. She didn't know where they were going. She knew only that they needed to go, to run, to flee, like a mouse harried through the night by the cries of an owl. They're coming. Nothing else mattered. Couldn't he see that? The longer they stood here, the greater the danger. "Hurry." She pulled at his hand. "Hurry." But he wouldn't budge. It was then that she saw they were all watching her. Mitsue, Ernley, Barnes, Floret, fear sparkling in their eyes, the entire spectrum of terror observable across their four faces, all of them looking to her to tell them what to do. What do we do? She closed her eyes and felt her breath squeezing from her lungs, tried to stem the fear shrinking the walls of her brain. Where could they go? It was all happening so fast, time rushing along beneath them. What do we do? And then in her mind she saw the stern eyebrows and the muscular figure of the abbess, and she knew. "The abbess," Ray said, in as commanding a tone as she could. "We need to find her." Mitsue nodded and released her hand and walked back to Ernley and helped him to his feet. "Come on," he said. The five of them sprinted down corridor after corridor. Children were now spilling from the dormitories, most still in their nightgowns, many clutching stuffed animals or blankets to their chests, their eyes wide and terrified. They all spoke at once, crying, gibbering, pleading, their words overlapping senselessly. Older orphans lurked around the outside of the crowd, their eyes red and puffy, not knowing what to say or too stunned to speak. Ray and the rest hit the blockade. "We'll have to go back," Ray said after failing to push through the crowd. But just as they turned, Abbess Carmine strode around the corner, her jaw squared imperiously, her posture straight as a razor. In place of the stern smile that ordinarily adorned her lips, she grit her teeth, her gaze red hot. It looked as though she'd been up late working, still dressed as she was in her habit. Behind her, the rest of the sisters followed in various states of undress, some without their veils, most in their nightgowns. A general murmur dissipated at Carmine's approach. All eyes turned in her direction. Then the volume in the hall intensified. Everyone talking at once, some seeking answers, others comfort. "What's going on? Why did the bells? What are we supposed to do? I'm scared." "Quiet!" Abbess Carmine's voice snapped like a whip crack. Instantly the assembly fell silent. She straightened her veil and said, "You will all proceed to the entrance hall. Dormitory heads will lead the way. There will be no pushing. There will be no running. You will proceed in a fashion becoming this abbey, and anyone who acts otherwise will answer to me. Now move!" Emboldened by her words, the tide turned, and the sea of people surged forward. Rei shouldered her way through, towing Mitsue along in her wake. "What's going on, Abbess? Why did the bells sound?" "There is only one reason the bells sound," the abbess replied brusquely, her mouth set, her eyes grim. "May the flames illuminate us all." Rei turned to Mitsue, her terror reflected in his eyes. Noctura. There had been no mistake then. They were coming. Rei combed through her memory, trying to gather every detail she'd ever learned about them. It was pitifully little. They weren't supposed to be real. They were a story told to make children behave. How many times had her mother tried that? She retraced the trajectory of dinners years before. Every night was the same. Rei would ask to be excused from the table. Her mother would swoop down on her, examining her plate as if it were a binding legal document. "You didn't eat your spinach," she'd say. "You didn't eat your broccoli. Why can't you be like Mitsue?" she'd ask, exasperated. Beside her, Mitsue would shift uncomfortably in his seat, his spotless plate sparkling in the firelight. Then there was nothing for it but to stay at the table until she'd finished, or her mom felt sorry for her, whichever came first. Rei would turn the black broccoli heads over while her mother hovered nearby. "The Noctura will get you if you don't eat your broccoli," she'd say. Even at that age, Rei didn't believe her. And then there were the stories before bed, so many nights where her father worked late, or months where he'd be away from home at the academy. Those times she'd crawl into her parents' bed with her mother. Mitsue would sit on the floor. He followed wherever she went. It didn't matter that she scorned him, mocked his accent and his pitiful grasp of Anglian. She couldn't get rid of him, and her mother didn't seem to mind his presence. Once they were settled in the darkness, her mother would hold a candle close to her face, so that the shadows wavered around her jaw. She'd tell them about Noctura, of shadows in the night, of dark things searching for hot blood, her expressions grotesque in the flickering candlelight. Rei could never sleep afterwards. Every noise in the dark house made her think of Noctura crawling towards her. Closer, closer, closer. Of course, she'd never believe a word of it once the moon had risen. Monsters don't exist, she'd tell herself. There was no darkness waiting to get her if she misbehaved, if she didn't eat her vegetables, if she threw apples at Mitsue. It's just a dumb story. Or so she thought. "And so the bell towers were constructed to signal the return of the Noctura," her teacher droned one day, reading placidly from the textbook. Rei had been staring out the window, watching the automobiles shuffle along the road, but at these words she jerked to attention. "You mean they're real?" she shouted before she could stop herself. The class all turned towards her and laughed. Her teacher frowned. "Were real," he corrected. "It's been more than 100 years since they were last seen." He adjusted his thick glasses. "And next time, raise your hand if you have a question, Miss Ashford." Rei couldn't believe it. "Did you know?" she asked Mitsue on their way home from school. He shook his head. "Does matter? They gone, yes." She pushed past him. "They are gone, idiot." She ran the rest of the way home, but as fast as she ran, she couldn't outdistance her fears.